Proseguiamo il nostro pomeriggio con Vasile Babota, and we are still in Gregorian University. I'm right, yes. And he's author of a book that it is about the institution of the Ashmonean high priesthood. And he is also responsible, involved in the, as I know, in the Ukraine translation of the Bible at an official level. So chief director. chief director. So higher it is impossible. So we have the high priest entering of the Holy of Holies in Leviticus 16 and some interpretations. Thank you.
Yes, please. Per favore. Grazie per la presentazione. Thank you for this introduction. So I have lightly altered my title. So now it's called the High Priest Entering of the Sanctuary in Leviticus 16 and some interpretations. And we shall see some of the reasons why I did this. This is the structure of my talk. And this is the basic structure of the book of Leviticus. And as we see, Leviticus 16 is roughly in the middle of the book. And on the narrative level, scholars have pointed out many times, it goes better with chapter 10 rather than with chapter 15. Some basic information with regard to this Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur or Yom HaKippurim. These are the 3 or 4 basic texts that we find in the Hebrew Bible that tell us something about this ritual. The richest is, of course, Leviticus 16, and probably the latest of this. There are, however, some differences between these texts, and there are also inner differences and sometimes contrasts within Leviticus 16 itself. Basically, all texts, biblical and non-biblical, agree on the fact that this feast fell on the 10th day of the 7th month, Tishri. It was a day of holy convocation, Mikra Kodesh. According to Leviticus 16, it had to be performed by Aaron. On the other side, Leviticus 23 and Numbers 29 do not mention a priest or high priest for that reason. In some cases, as we see, this ritual could be performed by the deputy high priest. And we find quite a few references to this figure. This is one of those verses in Leviticus 16 that tells much about the complexity of this text, both on literary, redactional, and terminological level. It's rich in terminology as far as the sanctuary is concerned, and is quite rich in terms of motion verbs. We can see already here also some difficulties in terminology, not just within the text, the Hebrew text itself, but also in rendering it into Greek. Okay, be better. Yeah. rimanere, si vede bene. So based on this description in Leviticus 16, we basically find out that the high priest was supposed to enter this most sacred area 3 times during this ritual. First time in according to verses 12, 13 to generate this incense, cloud of incense in front of this caporet mercy seat. Then the second time, verse 14, to sprinkle with his finger this caporet 7 times with the blood of the bull. And then again in verse 16, for the third time, to do the same thing, but this time with the blood of the goat. These are the motion verbs that we find in Leviticus 16 and their Greek correspondences. And we see already a kind of terminological turbulence in the Greek version, how they try to render each expression, which in Hebrew is basically of the same root. And we have esporevomai, we have eiserchomai, esporevomai, exerchomai, exerchomai, eiserchomai, and esporevomai, and again exerchomai here in verse 24. Now, we do have 2 more verbs, heavy, the hefil, and the hofal here. The hefil is rendered twice as eisoise from Pharaoh also, and then here Pharaoh, eis Pharaoh, they were passive for the hofal. In this case, it refers to the incense, for example, in verse 12. Here it refers to the blood in general that the high priest was supposed to bring into the sanctuary. Now, one of the observations I want to make at this point is the lack of the use of the term of the verb eisemi, which is extremely rare in the Septuagint, but widely attested in Greek literature, where we find narratives about the descriptions of the temple, of the sanctuaries, and the innermost part where the statues were located. And this verb occurs quite frequently, not only in literary corpora, but also in papyri and even in some inscriptions. And Homer is the first to use it, at least as far as we can say it. Now, and this is a bit strange that the Septuagint, being produced in a so to say Hellenistic environment away from Palestine, doesn't use only a few times this verb eisemi, which was on the other hand so frequently used in Greek literature in the same context, basically. Now, there are 2 things that the high priest is supposed to do. Actually, 1 thing, but twice, that is to wash himself before the ritual and at the end of the ritual. And this is a unique prescription that we find for a high priest in the Hebrew Bible. Elsewhere, this requirement is found only during the consecration ritual. However, if you look at the Aramaic Levi document, we do find this prescription twice. Once, it's again about the consecration of the Levi to the high priesthood. And another occasion is a prescription that tells that every time that the high priest approaches the temple and before putting the sacred vestments, he should bath and then enter the Bet El, temple of God. Now, the Aramaic Levi document is dated variously between late 4th century and early 2nd century. Now, if we look a bit slightly later in the temple scroll, for the same ritual, we only find the washing of the hands and of the feet. And I want to delve a bit into this temple scroll, as it tells us something about this ritual. And the only time, it's a bit fragmentary in this part, but the only time we find this root Bet Vav Aleph is connected to the sacrifice of the he-goat for Azazel. There is no mention of the sanctuary in this context related to the Day of Atonement. And consequently, all the cultic elements, ritual elements connected to this, to the sanctuary, related to the sanctuary, are lacking, obviously, from this text. Later, but in another context, we do find mention of the sanctuary, however, which in Greek translations is most often rendered as hechal. Now, according to at least Yadin, hechal, not hechal, but this hakodesh would refer not just to the sanctuary itself, but to the entire temple area. And that was his explanation to say why the temple scroll does not mention specifically the sanctuary in this context. Now, there is another document from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Apocrypha of Moses, and it too mentions the use of the blood of the bull of the ram, and ram is a novelty here because it doesn't appear in Leviticus 16. And then it tells, and this is a new thing that we learn, it talks about Aaron approaching probably the Ark of Testimony, and then it uses the expression vadarash, which has a variety of meanings, of course, but in this case, it probably refers to the study of the laws of Yahweh. And elsewhere, the Damascus document, Cairo-Damascus document, actually refers to the ark hiding this, containing this book of the law, Sefer HaTorah, which was in the ark, for it had not been opened in Israel since the day of the death of Eleazar and until Sadok. Sadok is referring to the priest at the time of David. So the sanctuary becomes the seat of the Torah, according to this document. And so it, by being there, being placed there, it acquires the highest sacred status. And another thing that we learn from this text is that the high priest, not the king, has access to it and the ultimate authority to interpret it. Yes, let's move to Philo of Alexandria a bit. He mentions 3 times the book of Leviticus expressly and quotes, paraphrase, or reduce to the Greek Leviticus hundreds of times, actually. The exact version he is using is not always clear. The chapter 16 alone is referred to more or less 32 times in Philo. One side note is that even though at the time of Philo there was another temple in Egypt closer to him, he never refers to it, but rather focuses on the temple of Jerusalem, which he calls Hieron, Naos, etc. And he claims he had visited it once. Now, some terminological notes with as far as Philo is concerned, he uses 3 different, basically, terms or expressions to denote this sacred area of the shrine. The first is Tahagiaton Hagion, which is Hebraism. And then the second, Toaduton, and sometimes in plural, which was widely used in Greek sources when referring to the same sacred area. And so he uses both these, even though he is not always coherent. And then another one that he probably took from the biblical text is this taisotato ton hagion. I will return later to this aduton because that's another question why the Hebrew, the biblical translator did not use it neither for books, let's say, translated in Egypt or those in Palestine. We don't find it in the Septuagint, whereas we find it hundreds of times in all Greek literature. So we can say that Philo has a huge esteem for the figure of the Jewish high priest. He uses mixed terminology to refer to the high priest. Most of the times he uses the typical Greek term title, but many times also using the traditional Hebrew one. And he was aware of the fact that there was a Day of Atonement that had to be performed once per year, this hapax. And the verbs employed to indicate the motion, the entering, is eiserchomai and eisemi, which we don't find, as I said, in the Septuagint. There is some intellectual journey that Philo offers when discusses this entering of the sanctuary. He has a variety of terms to relate to the high priest or to describe the high priest, especially not only his vestments, but also his mind. He says at some point that he ceases to be a man. He refers to him as logos sometimes refers to him as elechos, the reason, and so on. Basically, what he tries to say is that first, the high priest is alone who is able to see the innermost sacred area. So that already changes the perspective of Leviticus 16, where even the high priest could not, so to say, look inside. Then he goes on telling that the high priest offers this sacrifice and makes atonement for all humanity. So it's already opening, it's a universal act. It becomes from, so to say, ethnic, local to a universal action. And so he proceeds, the whole world cooperates with him in the performance of his sacred rites. And then he goes on to emphasize this aspect of universality by saying that the whole world enters with the high priest into the sacred area by way of his being the logos of God. That's how he calls him sometimes. And this is very particular representation of the high priest. And here is the verb sune serchetai. Now, looking from inside, we were looking into the sacred area. And if we look from the inside, what we can call is contamination by holiness, as Menachem Haran used this expression in his book on the temple. And that is, once the high priest is inside, he is, so to say, taken by this holiness, and so he becomes one whole with the sanctuary, and through him the whole humanity. Now, just a few notes on another Jewish scholar and priest of the late first century. He talks a lot of times about the high priest, very few times about priests, by the way. He personally knew several high priests, so he had, so to say, personal knowledge and experience of the last decades of the Jerusalem temple. Not much is found about the Day of Atonement in Josephus. Actually, he is very, so to say, meager in providing any information of the Day of Atonement. The only larger text is here in Antiquities, Book 3, and even this text seems to be a combination of two different sources, Leviticus 16 and Leviticus 23. So it seems, sorry, Numbers 29. So it seems. Now, he is also using this second term to describe the sanctuary, or the most sacred part of that shrine, to aduton, just like Philo did. Makes no mention of Aaron on this occasion, even though he is paraphrasing the biblical text at that point, but simply replaces the name of Aaron with Archiereus. And actually, the role of the high priest is also diminished. Now, another thing that we learn from Josephus is that there was no incense, or at least he doesn't say this, that the high priest would use incense to shield, so to say, this mercy seat from the rest of the people and from himself, first of all, and omits a few other cultic actions while adding new ones in his text. And now, one explanation could be that in one place he said there was nothing in the Holy of Holies, so maybe there was no need to use the incense for that reason. Now I will yes, okay. A few things on Hebrews. Of course, there is much more to say on Hebrews, but what we see here basically is a clear distinction between the first and second, so to say, part of this sanctuary. And here again, certain ritual cultic elements are omitted, while others are, so to say, more emphasized. Incense is also absent from this description of Hebrews. Refers more than 20 times to the high priest, to the archiereus. The verbs employ a serchomai and a seimi, so we find this a seimi in Hebrews at least once, but in reference to priests, not in reference to the high priest. And this is perhaps, so to say, the central words of the whole letter, as I can see it, where he builds on this concept of confidence in entering the sanctuary by the blood of Jesus. So in a way, what we saw in Philo is, so to say, the entering on the intellectual level, or moral level. In Hebrews is a spiritual entering, where even no high priest is present. So everything is happening on a different, so to say, level. And in this context, he is using once the expression, the title Hoherus Homegas. That's the only time that Hebrew uses this typical, Hebrews uses this typical Hebrew title to refer to Jesus. And here are some preliminary observations that I think I need not read, except that every author seems to have tended to update terminology, update certain, so to say, cultic actions. And this depended to a large extent to where he was living and in, so to say, which environment. So basically, once we learn something about the source and this author, it becomes more or less understandable why he wrote this or that. The only thing, or one of the few things that I found very, so to say, unusual is the lack of some Greek cultic terminology, typical Greek cultic terminology in Septuagint as a whole. Whereas in the non-biblical sources, this is becoming a normal, so to say, tendency. Grazie.